I remember the moment her eyes rolled, not the ceremony, not the speeches, not even the applause that washed over the rows like warm rain. What stayed with me was that single sharp rotation of my sister's pupils, a gesture so small it should have dissolved into the noise of the auditorium. And yet it sliced through everything, carving its own quiet scar across the evening. I had been watching her from the section reserved for faculty guests, pretending not to search for her in the sea of caps and gowns. She moved differently from the others, as if resisting gravity even when she tried to blend in. My sister had always carried a particular kind of disdain, a weary impatience with the world. At home we used to joke that she was born with a sigh lodged behind her teeth. When she was younger, it made her seem older than she was, precocious, observant, cold only when she felt cornered. As adults, though, that same expression hardened into something more brittle, like she was constantly bracing for a blow no one else could see. The commencement speaker droned on with an engineered warmth that felt pressure-tested for corporate brochures, honoring resilience, praising innovation, celebrating our youth as the architects of a better tomorrow. I watched the graduates fidget, stretch their legs, wrestle with their robes. When the CFO of Alethea Systems walked onto the stage, the audience brightened, though no one around me seemed to know exactly why he had been invited. He wasn't an alumnus, and the company had no visible attachment to the university except for a mysterious research partnership announced the previous fall. My sister straightened in her seat. For a moment I thought she was simply resetting her posture. But then she leaned forward, hands locked together, gaze trained on him with an intensity that unsettled me. Something inside her was bracing. I hadn't seen her that alert in years. Today, the CFO said, I want to acknowledge not just the accomplishments of this graduating class, but the individuals who shaped the future we are about to reveal. A ripple of confusion passed through the crowd. No one expected a revelation. Graduations rarely allow for surprises, they are rituals, predictable as tides. My sister exhaled so quietly the camera near the stage didn't catch it, but I did. I saw her shoulders fall by a fraction of an inch. I saw her jaw shift. And then, when a group of graduates behind her clapped prematurely, she rolled her eyes. Not a dramatic, exaggerated roll, just a flat, exhausted tilt upward, the kind that came from months or years of unspoken resentment. She thought no one noticed. But the auditorium screens caught her face at the exact wrong second, magnifying her expression to the size of a billboard. A few people laughed, unsure what they were laughing at. Some assumed she was reacting to the CFO's corporate platitudes. Others nudged each other, whispering about the girl in row 12 who has clearly had enough. I watched her freeze when she realized she'd been displayed. Her face smoothed itself back into a neutral mask, the kind she used to survive board meetings at her internship. For a heartbeat she looked like she might stand up and leave, diploma be damned. But she didn't. She stayed perfectly still, hands clasped in her lap as though holding herself together by pressure alone. Then everything shifted. We're thrilled, the CFO continued, to share that Alethea Systems has just finalized our plans for an IPO valuing the company at $15 million. The applause was immediate and enthusiastic, strange, considering how few people in the audience likely cared about the financial milestones of a company they had never heard of 10 months earlier. But the graduates reacted instinctively to the surge of excitement. Everyone except my sister. Her face didn't just still, it fell. A controlled collapse, like a structure weakening at its foundation rather than exploding outward. Her mouth parted slightly, not in awe but in dread. She blinked once, slow, deliberate, before lowering her eyes to her hands. I recognized the expression even from a distance. It was the one she wore the night she confessed she couldn't sleep without hearing the echo of her own mistakes. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting for inevitable consequences. Until that moment, I didn't know she had any connection to Alethea Systems. I assumed her constant tension came from the ordinary disappointments of adulthood, bills, promotions missed by inches, relationships that corroded instead of ending cleanly. But the look on her face was too specific, too personal. It was the look of someone who had just heard a verdict. The CFO continued speaking, promising opportunities for graduates, discussing innovation, inviting applause he hardly needed to solicit. He kept referencing the small but exceptional team who helped accelerate our progress. Each time my sister's shoulders tightened. I didn't understand the pieces yet, but I could feel them gathering. The ceremony trudged forward with ceremonial predictability, but I could barely concentrate. I watched her movements, subtle, restrained, almost rehearsed. She clapped when expected, stood when instructed, took her diploma with a polite nod. But underneath each action, a quiet tremor told me she was fragmenting. My sister was many things, competitive, guarded, fiercely intelligent, but she was not fragile. At least, not outwardly. So to see her unravel in real time, surrounded by thousands of people who assumed she was simply another tired graduate, sent a cold unease slipping down my spine. When the final applause faded and the graduates began to scatter toward families eager for photographs, she didn't turn in our direction. Instead, she stepped away from the crowd, weaving between clusters of students until she found an empty corner near the back of the auditorium. I watched her settle on the edge of a bleacher, gripping the diploma case as though afraid it would float away. I moved toward her, but slowly. I didn't want her to feel cornered. When I reached her row, she finally lifted her eyes. There was a hollow sheen in them I hadn't seen since the night she left our parents' house with nothing but a backpack. "You knew they'd announce it today," I said quietly. I didn't phrase it as a question. Her fingers tightened around the diploma. "Not like that." The noise of families reuniting rose around us, joyful and chaotic. It made her stillness feel even sharper. "What does it mean?" I asked. She looked at the stage where the CFO was still shaking hands with guests. A muscle jumped in her jaw. "It means," she said, "that something I thought I buried is about to surface in front of everyone who knows my name." There was no dramatics in her voice, no tremor. Just an exhausted certainty. I sat beside her, careful not to push for more. She had always been deliberate with her revelations, dropping them like stones into quiet water, never splashing, only sinking. She breathed in deeply, then exhaled the way someone does when stepping into cold water. "I worked for them," she said. "Alethea. The year before I came back home. I signed something I shouldn't have. And now the IPO is going to drag every decision I made into daylight." Her words weren't loud, but each carried weight. They settled between us like dust on a forgotten shelf. I let them linger, knowing she needed silence more than questions. But the silence only deepened the ache in her expression. Finally she whispered, "You're going to hear things soon. About what I did. About what I didn't do. And none of it will feel simple." Her voice cracked, not from emotion, but from restraint. "Whatever it is," I said, "you don't have to carry it alone." A faint, bitter smile touched her lips. "I've been carrying it alone for 2 years." She looked at her diploma as if seeing it for the first time. "I thought graduating would mean I finally outran everything." Her breath shuddered. "But all I did was buy time." She didn't cry. She rarely did. Instead, she shut her eyes as though bracing for a memory she wished would stay buried. When she opened them again, she said, "It started with a project they said would change the industry. And it did. But not the way they promised." The crowd had thinned by then, leaving us in a pocket of still air. The lights dimmed slowly as the university staff began closing sections of the auditorium. Whatever they announce next, she continued, will be built on what we did in those labs. And if anyone looks closely enough, they'll find the part one ruined. I felt something tighten in my chest, a quiet dread beginning its slow ascent. What part was that? I asked. She hesitated, not out of fear, but because the truth carried its own gravity. The part, she said softly, that was never supposed to be tested on real people. Her words echoed in the emptying room. And for the first time since the ceremony began, I understood why her face had fallen when the IPO was announced. Not because she feared exposure. Not because she regretted a miscalculation. But because somewhere buried beneath the spreadsheets, patents, and legal agreements she had signed, there were lives woven into her decisions, lives she believed she had failed. I felt the weight of that truth settle between us. Neither of us spoke. The world around us continued its slow retreat into silence while my sister stared down at her hands as though they still held the remnants of something she wished she could undo. Somewhere in the distance, a door clicked shut. She didn't look up. It wasn't supposed to go that far, she whispered. I didn't grasp the scale of what she carried until the days after graduation began to thin out, leaving behind an aftertaste of unfinished conversations. The ceremony had been a public moment, but whatever lived behind her expression belonged to a private history she had spent 2 years trying to manage without witnesses. That week she moved through her routines with a practiced steadiness, yet everything about her felt delicate, as if she were holding together a structure whose beams were beginning to bow. I visited her apartment more often than usual, partly out of worry and partly because she rarely asked for help outright. The place always smelled faintly of coffee and soldering flux. Her workstation, a relic from her internship days, sat in the corner like an unmoving sentinel. The blinds filtered the afternoon light into thin stripes that stretched across the floor, forming a quiet geometry over which she stepped each morning. She handled her days like someone sorting fragile glass, placing each task where it belonged and never allowing them to collide. But even the gentlest touch reveals cracks when you look closely enough. The first sign came from a small article, barely a paragraph, buried deep on a tech-focused site. It mentioned Alethea Systems, promising experiments in cognitive augmentation, and suggested there had been internal disagreements about methodology. The wording was vague in that particular way early rumors tend to be, shaped by speculation, sharpened by fragments of truth. When I showed her the article, she skimmed it too quickly, then placed the phone face down on the table. That's not about me, she said. But the line wavered at the edges. Over the next days, breadcrumbs began to appear. A tweet from a former contractor, an anonymous comment beneath an industry report, a brief mention during a webcast about ethical oversight. None of them named her. None pointed directly to wrongdoing. But it was enough for me to feel the outline of something larger pressing against the walls of her composure. One afternoon I found her seated at our mother's old kitchen table, surrounded by binders filled with documents I had never seen, printouts of cohort data, internal memos, meeting notes scribbled in her tight handwriting. She stared at the papers as if they were evidence of a life she wished she had not lived. I shouldn't have kept these, she said. But I couldn't throw them away either. She pushed a binder toward me and asked me to read. Inside was a sequence of progress reports from her time in the lab, carefully worded summaries praising team synchronicity and reduced trial times. At first glance nothing looked alarming. But as pages unfolded, so did a trend: shortened observation windows, modifications to consent forms, trial expansions that seemed to drift beyond their original scope. It wasn't one decision, she said. It was a series of tiny allowances. And every time we made one, management adjusted the goalposts and told us we were still doing everything right. I asked when she had first realized something was wrong. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pulled out a small notebook, worn at the edges, its pages covered in handwriting that wasn't hers. "This belonged to Matteo," she said, placing it gently in front of me. The name meant little to me then, just a colleague she had mentioned once or twice. But as she flipped through the notebook, I saw observations written with a kind of earnest precision that made them feel deeply human. One entry described a volunteer's subtle disorientation. Another expressed concern about irregularities in sleep patterns that should not be ignored. "He noticed what the rest of us were trying not to see," she said. "And he kept asking questions long after management told us to stop." She paused, then added in a quieter voice, "His son used to visit the lab once in a while. He'd bring a little toy plane. Matteo kept it on his desk." Even in memory, the detail held a gravity that pulled her downward. When the company's IPO announcement went public, the world reacted with excitement. News sites praised the breakthrough. Investors celebrated. Alethea's reputation swelled into something polished and triumphant. But the celebration also acted like a floodlight. It exposed inconsistencies others had previously ignored. Within days, the first request for documentation arrived at her inbox. Then another. Then a phone call from a journalist who claimed to have received credible information, suggesting procedural irregularities. My sister closed her apartment curtains for the first time since she'd moved in. The journalist, her name was Mara, asked to meet. My sister hesitated. "Not out of fear of exposure," she said, "but out of fear that her truths would be handled loosely, turned into spectacle instead of clarity." Still, she agreed to a meeting at a quiet cafe that smelled faintly of boiled sugar and burnt milk. I sat near enough to watch without intruding. My sister arrived early, choosing a seat near the window. She kept her coat on even after sitting, a habit she adopted in the months after leaving Alethea. When Mara arrived, she greeted my sister not like a source but like someone aware she was stepping into another person's private wreckage. They spoke for more than an hour. My sister's hands moved minimally, her voice, though steady, carried a subtle tremor whenever she described the escalation of decisions she now understood as ethically compromised. She avoided sensational phrasing. She avoided assigning blame casually. She described what she saw, what she recorded, and the unease that grew with each deviation from protocol. At one point Mara asked, "Why didn't you walk away sooner?" My sister stared at her hands before answering. "Because I wanted to believe the harm wasn't real. And once I realized it was, I thought I could still fix it from the inside." The article that followed was thoughtful, restrained, almost painfully factual. It did not accuse, it revealed. It did not condemn, it contextualized. It painted Alethea as ambitious, yes, but dangerously willing to obscure risks for the sake of momentum. It quoted former lab workers anonymously. It highlighted inconsistencies in trial documentation. It described one volunteer whose symptoms had worsened after participating in a shortened protocol. It ended with a question rather than a claim: what price does innovation place on the individuals it promises to help? For a day, nothing happened. Then everything did. Alethea's communications department released a statement praising journalistic curiosity, while dismissing concerns as unverified interpretations. Investors expressed confidence. Yet behind the scenes, emails began arriving in my sister's inbox with increasing insistence. And then Matteo's mother called. Her voice was thin, cracked around the edges by exhaustion. She explained that Matteo had been struggling, forgetting tasks, losing his sense of orientation, falling into long silences. She had taken him to a clinic where doctors suggested follow-up tests, but delays piled up, and she feared she was watching her son disappear in fragments. She wanted to know what had happened in those labs, and whether anything she read in the article tied back to him. My sister listened without interrupting. When the call ended, she pressed her fingers into her eyes as though trying to stop something from rising behind them. Then she stood, went to her cabinet, and pulled out a series of files she had not shown me before. "These are the sessions he worked on," she said. The logs were spare but revealing, repeated alerts about a decline in volunteer responsiveness, notes recommending extended monitoring that were later marked as non-essential, a redacted internal message directing the team to prioritize progress milestones. "They always said we weren't doing anything harmful," she whispered. "And maybe we weren't supposed to. But harm doesn't need intention to take shape." What emerged from those files was not a single catastrophic mistake but a gradient of negligence, a series of overly optimistic interpretations masking escalating risk. My sister had not authored the most damaging decisions, but she had been adjacent to them. She had complied with directives she didn't fully support. And she bore the weight of that compliance like a bruise she couldn't hide. As news of Mateo's condition spread through private channels, other volunteers began coming forward, quietly at first, then with growing urgency. One reported lingering headaches and memory gaps. Another described episodes of disorientation. A third had been dismissed by her doctor, who suggested stress as the cause. It became clear that people were suffering while the company insisted everything remained well within acceptable variance. The phrase made my sister flinch every time she heard it. Then came the day we learned that Mateo had vanished. His mother found his apartment door unlocked, lights off, dishes still in the sink. His keys were on the counter. His shoes were missing. The police were called, and a missing person bulletin went out the following morning. My sister drove to the precinct alone. She didn't tell me until after she returned. She sat in the back of the station, answering questions from an officer who kept glancing at her as though recognizing her name from somewhere. He asked whether she believed Mateo's disappearance was connected to the research. She chose her words carefully. "I believe he was unwell," she said. "And I believe the systems meant to monitor him failed." The investigation gained momentum quickly. A local news outlet reported the disappearance. Social media communities seized upon the story. Some users demanded transparency from Alethea, while others dismissed the concerns as overreaction. The usual split of outrage and denial formed overnight. Alethea's response was swift and calculated. They expressed sympathy for Mateo's family and pledged full cooperation. They reassured investors the situation posed no risk to long-term strategic growth. They repeated that their protocols met industry standards. Yet inside those statements was a quiet panic. They knew the chain of decisions was beginning to surface. For my sister, the visibility of it all brought a new kind of strain. Walking down the street meant overhearing fragments of conversations about the company. Checking her email meant navigating requests for comments from advocacy groups. Her silence, once a form of self-protection, began to look like withholding. Her willingness to speak, once an act of courage, began to look like self-incrimination. One night I found her sitting on her balcony, her coat wrapped tightly around her despite the warm air. She stared at the city like someone watching a storm gather beyond the skyline. "I didn't 'cause what happened to them," she said softly. "But I'm tied to it. Whether I want to be or not." I sat beside her. "There's a difference between responsibility and blame." She shook her head. "Not in the public eye. Not in the legal system. And not in my own mind." The days that followed became a blur of accumulating pressure. Regulators requested documents. The advocacy group announced an independent review. Journalists camped outside Alethia's headquarters. Lawyers began to circle the situation, speaking in measured tones about potential exposure and risk mitigation. Inside her apartment, my sister continued sorting files into neat stacks, as if preparing for a reckoning she couldn't yet outline. Each document she placed into a folder seemed to shift something in her posture, an acceptance, a resolve, a slow movement toward whatever justice would eventually demand of her. But beneath all of it was a quieter fear, that Matteo might never be found, and that his disappearance would become one more unsolved wound folded into the corners of an investigation. And though she didn't say it aloud, I understood another fear taking shape. That when the truth finally surfaced, it would expose not just the company's ambition, but the parts of herself she had tried so hard to leave behind. The months that followed the disappearance felt like the slowest kind of weather. Nothing dramatic happened all at once. Instead, pressure accumulated in a way that makes mountains grow, incrementally, invisibly, until the landscape itself has changed. The company's spokespeople learned the language of contrition without the texture of remorse. Regulators asked procedural questions, lawyers calculated exposure like angles of light. Journalists sharpened their pens. An independent review board, convened under public scrutiny, requested access to raw data and participant logs. The city's small forums that had once cheered for innovation now catalogued absences. My sister and I lived inside those catalogs, tracing the margins where people's names became footnotes. It was not only legal processes and press cycles. It was the private arithmetic of grief and responsibility, the calls from families with urgent, uneven voices, the visits to clinics where clinicians repeated phrases that left no room for repair, the sense that whatever truth would surface would arrive as both liberation and indictment. She began to move in the world differently. Where before she had been reluctant to speak at all, she now learned the economy of testimony. She chose words with the measured attention of someone translating a language that could otherwise be weaponized. She stopped imagining that her presence inside the corporation had been purely accidental, and instead treated her past role as a ledger, entries to be accounted for, annotations to be corrected. The independent review produced the kind of slow, surgical revelations that are both satisfying and acidic. They did not scream headlines. They recorded omissions, mismatches between signed consent forms and the versions retained by the legal department, inconsistencies in logging adverse events. They documented the pressure in memos to reduce monitoring overhead and a pattern of marginalizing dissenting internal voices. The report did not, and could not, prove culpability in a criminal sense. What it did show was institutional willingness to favor growth metrics over thoroughness. That, for many, was a wound deep enough. When the report was released, Alethia's stock stuttered. The market treated the findings as a recalibration, not a catastrophe. Investors like numbers. Narratives of systemic complacency are rarely converted into immediate financial ruin. But the reputational damage had a different currency. Volunteers withdrew, some seeking restitution, clinicians stepped back from partnerships, new hires asked harder questions at interviews. The company's sheen dulled. Public pressure bred a cascade of civil suits. Families filed claims that read like maps of interruption, lost employment, medical bills, cognitive impairments measured in observations and second opinions. Lawyers arrived who were less interested in spectacle than in reconstruction. They wanted timelines, the provenance of data, signatures, timestamps. Paperwork, the thing my sister had hoarded like contraband, became the most potent material evidence. There were hearings. People who had once been anonymous in the margins were asked to speak with clarity about the ways their lives had shifted. The process was brutal in small, intimate ways. Depositions turned memory into a grid: who was on call, who signed off, who noted anomalies and failed to escalate them. It was not dramatic the way films imagine reckoning, rather it was administrative, detailed, and unyielding. The law, when it decides to listen, is an instrument that reduces chaos into categories. For many it is salvation, for others, including my sister, it was both a ladder and a gauntlet. She testified in one of those hearings. I sat in the back of a narrow room while she answered questions with the precision she had learned to trust. She spoke not to cast blame in cinematic gestures but to reconstruct a sequence of choices. She spoke about cohort definitions and parameter changes, about alarms that were deprioritized, about a culture that equated speed with success. She did not plead for absolution. She did not ask the room to understand her as a tragic figure. She put facts on the table and, in doing so, asked for accountability measured by action rather than public pity. The hearing did not unmake everything. The legal process almost never returns the world to its previous shape. But it did do something important. It created a record that could no longer be smoothed away with press releases. Deposit by deposit, a scaffold of responsibility was built. Expert witnesses corroborated clinical concerns. Encrypted logs my sister had kept became central exhibits. Matteo's name appeared in a footnote that refused to be erased. There were settlements, not triumphal payouts, but the kind of careful arrangements that acknowledge harm without pretending to rewind time. Some families received compensation that helped with medical expenses and care. Some volunteers chose the courtroom route, others accepted mediation. Money did not reverse the nights they had lost or restore what had frayed in memory, but for a contained moment it allowed for practical care instead of mere apologies on glossy letterhead. More significant than settlements was the change in practice. The review board's recommendations were accepted in part and fought in others, corporate leadership shuffled, and a new oversight panel was established with external representation. Consent forms were rewritten to be clearer, monitoring windows were lengthened, and independent auditors were granted access to anonymized datasets. The measures were pragmatic and imperfect, hygiene more than salvation, but they mattered. They created a framework in which something like vigilance could persist. The company did not become a paragon. It remained a corporation with investors and pressures. But it mutated, the way a city can alter zoning to protect a shoreline after a flood. My sister did not revel in the shifts. She watched them with the careful suspicion of someone who had been inside a machine and understood its gears. For her, the point was always restitution and repair, not performative remorse. Matteo was found. Not in a single cinematic reveal but through a slow accumulation of leads and the persistence of people who refused to let the story fade. He turned up in a small clinic outside the city, disoriented, frightened, and suffering from episodic memory loss that had confounded early examinations. The first time I saw him, he held a paper plane in his hand. It was creased and soft at the folds, the sort of object that acquires character through repeated gestures of care. When he tried to place the year he had last flown it with his son, the moment slipped through him like a missing tile. He would not be the same as before, no one promised he would be. But he was present, and presence itself was an answer to some small prayer. His recovery was not linear. There were days of bright clarity and days when his words thinned. He participated in therapy focused on cognitive rehabilitation, supported by the settlements that had arrived. He reunited with his son in a guarded, awkward meeting orchestrated by social workers. The scene was not cinematic catharsis, it was stitches and soft apologies and the susurrus of two lives trying to find new terms. Watching Matteo in those months taught me how little control any of us have over the arc of harm, and how much the persistence of others can matter when the world is frayed. My sister did not seek forgiveness. She did not perform contrition. What she did was begin to restitch things she could reach. She worked with advocacy groups to create clearer protocols for informed consent, to lobby for mandatory oversight of trials that enter public partnerships, and to assist in training clinicians on the subtle signs that a participant might be slipping. She joined panels and spoke with a voice that had been tempered by regret but also by a refusal to let complexity be an excuse. When the dust settled enough for us to breathe, small changes in her life began to come into focus. She stopped sleeping in the afternoons as if guarding for nightmares. She resumed an old habit of walking at dawn along the river with a thermos of coffee she barely drank. She reconnected, cautiously, with friends she had distanced herself from. There was a tenderness in her laughter again, but it never reached the earlier brazenness. It was careful, a sound that had been repaired and would not be stretched thin. The public, fed by cycles that forget as much as they learn, moved on in ways that were both inevitable and unsettling. New companies rose with new promises. Investors shifted their attention. Headlines turned. That is how time functions on a grand scale. It tends toward novelty. But the changes we had enforced, the audits, the rewritten consent forms, the oversight boards, remained as stubborn, bureaucratic witnesses. They were not poetic, but they were durable. At home, our family had to find a way to live with the knowledge that loving someone does not eliminate the quality of their choices. Our conversations changed. We stopped pretending ignorance about the structures that shape opportunity and harm. We talked pragmatically about inheritance, about care, about reputations. We rebuilt trust in small, actionable ways. My sister would answer her phone more often. She would come to family dinners without checking her email mid-meal. Those were tiny, human measures, but they mattered. They felt like stitches on the inside. Sometimes, in quiet moments when the city hummed below and the curtains blurred the light, she would stare at the diploma she still kept in a drawer. It had become an artifact that no longer signified triumph but rather the place where a path had forked. She had once equated escape with certificate, the idea that an education is a passport out of the past. She had learned that passports do not inoculate you from consequence. They complicate it. One night, months after the hearings, we returned to the auditorium where she had rolled her eyes. The university had scheduled a panel on research ethics in applied technologies and had invited those who had fought to make the process public. She did not speak at first. Instead, we sat in the far rows and watched young graduates file in, faces bright with possibility. The panel discussed frameworks and oversight and the need for moral imagination in design. Afterward, some students came forward with questions. They were earnest in a way that made me think about trust as a kind of work rather than a state. My sister answered one of the students' questions without ceremony. She told them that the hardest part of her journey was not the external consequences but the internal unraveling, the moment she realized that the person she was willing to be inside a machine was not the person she had thought herself to be. She told them that if they wanted to change the world, they must first build institutions that could be changed by the people they served. The language was not neat, it was honest, and that honesty had weight. Justice was not a perfect arc. There was no image of a villain being humiliated on live television, no single moment of vindication that made everything right. Instead, justice arrived as a mosaic of smaller acts, a legal record that made erasure harder, settlements that allowed for care, procedural reforms that increased oversight, public conversations that taught a new generation of engineers to ask harder questions. Renewal did not mean forgetting. My sister carried her work like a scar, a memory that did not define her wholly but that shaped how she moved. She found ways to use the knowledge she had gathered in the lab for practical, ethical initiatives. She started a small nonprofit that trained community clinics to recognize cognitive side effects early and provided pro bono audits for small research firms. The nonprofit did not become a large institution or a headline maker. It existed in a quieter register, curriculum development, grant applications, workshops in community centers. Its successes were measured in fewer missed follow-ups and in clinicians who no longer dismissed patients' odd complaints. The world, for its part, continued to rotate. New technologies emerged. New promises were made. And, also for its part, the world had been nudged in ways that made harm less likely to be quietly absorbed. That nudge did not absolve my sister or transform corporate ambition, but it created space for accountability. There are days now when I watch her from the kitchen doorway as she prepares coffee, hands steady. She has a small scar near the knuckle of her left index finger from a time she burned herself fixing an old soldering iron. She shows it when she tells a story about being reckless in her 20s and offers the scar as proof that you can be both careful and fallible. She is kinder in small things, less quick to vanish into herself. She still carries the memory of those who suffered. It is a presence as sure as any compass, but it does not corrode her entirely. We never did get everything back. Mateo's memory never knitted wholly the way it had been. Some relationships did not survive. Our family learned to accept partial losses. But what we also learned is that partial loss does not preclude meaning. There is a form of moral work that is not heroic in the cinematic sense but practical: documentation, honest testimony, the tedious labor of setting up safeguards. If the narrative has a final image, it is not courtroom fireworks or headlines. It is a small table in a community center where my sister and a clinician explain, gently and plainly, why consent matters and how to watch for tiny changes in a volunteer's behavior that could predict larger harm. A woman in the back asks a question about trust. My sister answers with brutal care, acknowledging the limits of institutions and the ways individuals are often asked to bear the cost of collective ambition. The answer is not tidy. It is a set of practices and reminders and a promise to do the work no one else wanted. At graduation, her eye roll had been a private punctuation in a public scene. It felt, then, like a small act of exhaustion. What it marked, retrospectively, was the beginning of an arc that would test what it means to be responsible in a world that prizes scale. What followed was a reckoning that did not erase pain but insisted that consequences be matched with concrete change. She speaks of the future now with a tempered hope. Not naive, not triumphant, but steady. She talks about repairs, about the mundane work of policy and training and attentive oversight. She refuses grand remedies and instead offers the kind of persistent, patient labor that can, in small increments, tilt systems toward care. The story closes, not cleanly, because human lives seldom do, but with a sense of weary, honest renewal. Justice had arrived in fragments, documents that could no longer be denied, hearings that recorded truth, practices that made future harm less likely. Renewal came in the work she chose after exposure, teaching, rerouting attention, offering the knowledge she had to those who might otherwise repeat the same mistakes. It is not a catharsis, it is a continuing commitment. When I think of that auditorium and the moment her face fell at the CFO's announcement, I understand it now as a hinge. It turned a private regret into a public claim, and that claim, messy and compromised as it was, forced a conversation we should have had long before, about how we measure progress, about what we are willing to sacrifice for innovation, and about the people who are quietly asked to be the cost of our boldest ideas. We will keep asking those questions. We will keep pressing for institutions that do not mistake momentum for morality. And somewhere between the hearings and the community workshops, between Mateo's slow recoveries and my sister's careful, deliberate steps forward, we built a fragile, necessary truth, that when harm is acknowledged and met with steady accountability, the work of repair becomes possible. It is not heroic. It is simply human.